whatever ChatGPT is doing, where it's an organization, a multinational organization creating a thing that appears and pretends to be your best friend, but is actually acting in the corporation's best interests and has incentives that are inherently and must be different from yours, that's extremely compelling. Like, that's not it. That's a hollow experience. We're like in the late stage of this extractive kind of thing where we're all just trying to wring more out of these walled gardens. And what bothers me is that all of us seem to have forgotten that. And everyone's like in this zombie state. I'm like, well, the thing says make number go up, so what are you gonna do?
Hi, Rabble.
Hey, Alice.
So today's guest is Alex Komoroske, a former Google product manager and someone who recently helped create Resonant Computing Manifesto. And he's also working on something new that he hasn't released information about. We weren't able to get too many details about that, called Common Tools. In your conversation, he talked about a lot around product development and like, you know, how those processes can go. And there's just one thing that really stuck in my mind that I love, that, you know, in development, people can get very attached to their own ideas, their own kind of the features that they put forward. And when he worked at Google, he said he used to ask people, if Facebook shipped this product or feature, how would you feel about it? And it inevitably yielded like a different response to the one they've been attached to. So anyway, why did you want to talk to him? Like, tell us a bit about resonant computing you know, how you got to know Alex.
So, I got to know Alex because he has been for the last several years organizing these salons where he gets together a bunch of people in tech and has a dinner of a dozen people. And he does it once a month. And it's about creating space for people in the tech industry to talk to each other, to tackle these big, hard problems. And he's someone who worked on Google Chrome and helped bring it into an open ecosystem and advocated for protocols in the open web. But he's also someone who has been bringing together the people inside the tech industry who are advocating for making the world a better place, advocating for building technology that makes us feel good, that makes us feel empowered, that isn't the doom scrolling, that isn't the exploitation, that isn't this sort of nightmare that might drive people to authoritarianism. You know, it's a how do we organize people in the tech industry who are fundamentally broadly socially progressive. And I see him as sort of one of the anchors that advocates against this, the all-in guys, where they're just about, let's just
what can they get out of it for themselves?
The great heroes of it. And he has an amazing metaphor he talks about, which is the archetypes from Lord of the Rings and who we should be looking to. And I think it's a really powerful story.
Yeah. And I think this idea that technology can be additive to our lives, right? It doesn't have to be subtractive or that we have to somehow be giving something up in order for the corporations to succeed. Well, let's jump in and take a listen.
I'm really excited to have Alex Komoroske on Revolution.Social. He was a longtime Google exec and former head of corporate strategy at Stripe. When at Google, he worked on search, the DoubleClick ad platform, added AR to Google Maps, and in what we talk about the most here is he worked on Chrome's open web platform, about making the web as an open ecosystem work and making it interoperable and free of proprietary lock-in. So welcome, Alex.
Thanks for having me.
Before we get into things, you have this story about someone who told you that your career was undermined by your ethics in some way, and that you'd be a VP at Google if you hadn't spent so much time thinking about the implications of what we're building. I wonder if you could tell that story, because it's really great.
I just had, I had a number of amazing mentors. I really believe my time at Google was amazing, and I really respect the hell out of a lot of people there. I learned a ton, and especially all the time I was there, I felt like it was a really positive force for humanity. And also, I think I saw stuff there that I think is now just endemic throughout the entire tech industry. It was not specific to Google. I had a lot of amazing mentors, but I had somebody who tried to forcibly mentor me every so often, which, by the way, is not a thing. Mentorship has to be consensual. And she would meet with me every quarter or so and just nag the projects I was working on, as I guess in an attempt to get me to want to work on her team or something. And at one point I was talking about this thing is when I was on Google Maps and I had Google Earth was part of my remit. And I was talking about this cool bottoms up ecosystem-y thing that was doing something good for the world that I was excited about. And she goes, oh, Alex, you'd be a VP by now, you'd be a VP by now if you stopped thinking through the implications of your actions. And it was like this thing that was like, aren't you, what? Aren't you embarrassed? Like, isn't that like a shocking thing to admit? And what I've realized in the tech industry, especially nowadays, is like, I don't know, I got into the tech industry for like the hacker ethic and the idea of technology as a thing to help human flourishing in a way of like these positive indirect effects. And that is not at all where we are today. We are in a position where we're like in the late stage of this extractive kind of thing where we're all just trying to wring more out of these walled gardens. And what bothers me is that all of us seem to have forgotten that. And everyone's like in this zombie state. I'm like, well, the thing says make number go up. So what are you going to do? Like, I don't know. Maybe you think about what the machine is that you're building.
We've decided the KPIs are this way and this is what we should be doing.
It's just funny to watch such smart people who I know, a lot of people who got into this industry for the same reason as me, just become, it's like this dullifying process that, and by the way, I think this is not only attached to just the tech industry. I think this is endemic of modern society. Modern society is all about optimization. And I think optimization is great. Optimization creates efficiency. It can help reduce bias in certain situations. It can be like a systematic, whatever. But it comes at a cost. And we've never really grappled with what that cost is, that lack of authenticity and resonance, which I'm sure we'll get into. And so you can't make a trade-off if you don't know that there's two ends of the thing. So modern society is like all in on optimization, all in on making number go up. How many followers can you get? How much money can you make in the prediction market by having low integrity about the proprietary information you have or whatever. And that's just what all of modern society has become in the digital space. And that has become a much larger portion of our lives. And so we are in this fundamental disconnection from our humanity and the way that we spend most of our lives. And then you walk down the street and your neighbors and the people you see in your communities feels like a totally disjoint thing. But this is where we are most human, when we have repeated interactions with people that we care about, when we learn to get along and to grow together in ways where we don't just try to figure out, battling of ideas or something. And I feel like we've lost it in tech. It's
fascinating because one of the things that, the reasons I'm doing this podcast, the reason I'm talking to people is I have, we both worked in this industry for a really long time, and we've worked with tremendously caring, progressive people who cared about humanity, cared about the implications of what we were doing, and we're doing it for the best kind of reasons. And yes, these businesses made money. Yes, but they also changed the world, and they also have had a lot of really positive impact. But these organizations, they change over time, slowly. They go from these values-driven organizations that are really innovative to something that you saw at Google that became something else. And you created this deck called the slime mold deck, which addresses this very thing of the way in which the institutions, the organizations, the corporations we're creating change over time, not just change in values, but change in their ability to function. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and the insights into these institutions.
I have a particularly weird perspective on this, I guess. My degree is in social studies. And so I wrote my thesis on the emergent power dynamics of Wikipedia's user community. Under what conditions do you get this bottom up emergent structure that creates convergent value? What has to be true in that? So I've always been obsessed with the kind of a sociological lens of how does this emergent process work out of these incentives, these local mechanisms that lead to this much larger thing. Google search, you could argue, is fundamentally a distillation process over the link stream, the query stream, and the click stream. And so it's all about taking these authentic human interactions, distilling them down to pure signals, and then multiplying them and leveraging them to help other people. And so organizations also have that same dynamic. I find that we so naturally fall into an anthropomorphizing and thinking that all systems have a face. And there's a villain somewhere. This thing is achieving a bad outcome. There must be somebody bad here. And I don't know, I find that you can have a system that's entirely staffed by people who are collaborative, hardworking, and good at what they do, and still have a thing that is, impossible to get things done or achieves ends that each and every member of the collective thinks is a bad thing to have happen. And you get these effects emergently with no particular person pushing for them. And I look for these. For these, I look for the asymmetries. What's the thing that fundamentally is true inescapably One of them is coordination goes up with the square of the number of people that have to coordinate. And so as you get larger and larger and larger, imagine it takes you and me a conversation. It takes us a 10-minute conversation to get to some nuanced understanding that combines the best of your insight and my insight into what should we do? How should we change this product? But now imagine I have to have that with 1,000 people. I only have 30 seconds each. And so the depth of idea that I can express goes from, a multiply idea to like, a thing that in 30 seconds they get and they like, and everyone can agree makes sense. And one of the things that everyone can agree makes sense is make number go up. If this is a number that all of us act like is an important number because it drives directly to the bottom line, then no one ever got fired for making number go up. And so you fall into this thing where it's easier to coordinate around the thing that everybody already obviously agrees is important. At each point, you could push for what are we losing when we do this? And at each point, you're going to get exhausted from just constantly having to be putting pressure on the other end of this lever.
Hey, just a quick interruption to ask you to follow Revolution.Social on your podcast app, YouTube, or wherever you use social media. And if you're already following us, please tell a friend about the show and publish it. Thank you so much. It's super fascinating because, you have this situation where at all of these big companies, they're raking ridiculously large amounts of money. And we see it with especially the social media companies that optimize their algorithms for engagements that are clearly not making people better and clearly not even in the interest of the platform. Optimizing for making posts that cause people to do rage responses and engage in flame wars and, make people hate the tools they're using.
And want to use it less in the future even sometimes, directly undermining the core success criteria even. What drives me crazy is it's not even it's some hippy dippy thing that you should be thinking about, the indirect impacts of your actions beyond making money, which I do believe is important. But even if someone said, it's all about making money and the market sorts it out, you still have a problem, even in that frame, that people are taking actions that undermine the entire engine of value creation in the long term. And that drives me insane. I don't even understand. It's so irrational. It's so just because we're all constantly focusing on the short, fast twitch thing, and there's no time to think through things. And as it gets increasingly cacophonous, there's even less time to think.
We've created a situation where people hate this thing. They feel addicted to it. We have this giant drive for age and ID verification to protect the kids, which is a moral panic of people trying to do something, even if it's not going to work.
A politician's fallacy, yeah.
Yeah, you understand why people want to do something.
Yeah.
And the question everybody has is, so why do they do this? Are they doing this because they're evil? And as you work in these companies, you find that the people are not evil. Every single person is doing that because they believe in providing tools and making the world a better place. Yet we've got an incentive system within these organizations that makes that thing hard to measure.
Yep. Yes. It's the asymmetry is towards the easier thing to measure. It turns out the easiest thing to measure is short-term direct effects. That's way easier,
Yeah. And then we generate these KPIs like the, key performance indicators. And then everybody's like, well, the person who gets the most, wins the game at the KPIs. That's obviously the person who should be promoted. That's obviously the kind of behavior we want to reward in these organizations. And it ends up harming everybody.
Everybody loses. The customers, the shareholders, the employees, society, and not necessarily immediately. Most of these actions, one of the reasons it's kind of pernicious is there's one little thing of this one thing has diffuse negative results that's been really, really, really thin. And so very clear value, diffuse negative results. Can I even see them? I don't know. And then but they add up significantly. And the indirect effects almost dominate the overall the direct effects just happen to be easy. You've heard the streetlight fallacy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So a drunk is looking for his keys, he's lost underneath the streetlight, and someone comes to help him and says, "Oh, okay, did you drop them over here?" He goes, "No, but this is where the light is." And that's what we do. Is this the most important thing? No, but this is what's easy to measure. Okay, but when you get out of bed in the morning, do you think, is this thing that I'm part of, that I'm helping push forward in my small way, is it something that I'm proud exists? Is it something that if it went, I'll look back on in 10 years, you'd be like, whew, glad I was part of that. Or you'd be like, ooh, that got to be a thing that I don't think we think that enough about that long-term because long-term we have an intuition. about whether this is something I'm proud of. I'm not proud of being addicted to Candy Crush. I am proud of being addicted to Peloton and being, doing a Peloton streak where I've been going for like 3,000 days or something stupid. And like, that's the thing that's aligned with my interest of being healthy and exercising. And it's got a little bit of an addictive thing for me, but like, doing a thing that like, I'm glad if more people were also addicted to some form of, significant exercise, that would probably be good for society. So like, I can feel proud about that.
I really love Candy Crush so much so that I built my own clone that's pro-social for myself.
Nice.
Where, and it's not as fancy and it's not as beautiful as Candy Crush, but it works, and it works really well. And it's set up so that it's only meant to be played when I don't have an internet connection and I'm saying, I'm on an airplane or something else, or maybe I'm listening to a podcast. And it's really fascinating that I can take the game that has been optimized for addiction and make a version of it for myself that's not optimized for addiction. And the irony is that like I could publish it and release it, which I might do, but it's not going to have the viral effect of a business. It's antiviral.
Like no business could make that decision because every business has to drive, well, wait a second, how's this going to share to a thing? And it's actually important that when he gets stuck, you can hit this button and all 10 of his friends see he's playing Candy Crush and needs a heart or whatever from them to like it, whatever. Like that loop is so core to the thing. Like that's a piece of software only you could build for yourself. In a world now with infinite software, it's possible to do that with LLMs in a way that really hasn't been possible before.
Yeah. So, your slime mold deck is a few years old, and I don't remember exactly when you put it out, but the world of software is heavily inspired by this architect or the person who studies architecture, Christopher Alexander, created the pattern language, and he studied how we use buildings. And my mom is an architect, and she went to UC Berkeley, where you live at Berkeley, just down the street from your place. And there they talk about the way in which our built environment, our physical environment that we build, is going to then shape how we behave inside it. And so you can live at a library and you can, have a study group at a dive bar, and you can do these things in different environments, but these environments have things that they encourage behavior, and they have things they make easier, and they drive us to patterns of acceptance. And so many people in software development have been inspired by the pattern language and this idea of design patterns for a really long time.
I think people actually don't even realize, I didn't realize that design patterns, like the word patterns, comes directly from that lineage. Like that was not obvious to me until even a few years ago. Having known, it's like, oh, that's so funny. That's like a kind of the similar word. Nope, that's actually the direct lineage of where the Game 4 were inspired by that book and well,
because this is with every industry, but in the tech industry, we learn from each other, and we use these sets of patterns and language, and sometimes we don't even know where they come from. The academic Fred Turner talks about the ideology of Silicon Valley and how it comes from the intersection of the military industrial complex down in the Valley and Park, and the hippies, Stuart Brand and all these other folks who started intermixing. And that's why we have Silicon Valley's ideology. And, Stuart Brand was very interested in architecture. And so, he's one of these people that helped bring it back and forth. And so you use that as a metaphor and as a framing for the Resonant Computing Manifesto. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what it is, what it advocates for, and why it's important.
For me, the core notion of like resonance is a word that we don't often use for this, but I think we all know this feeling. What Christopher Alexander calls it the quality without a name. It's when you're in a space and it just makes you feel alive. Like you could spend as much time as you wanted there. You feel like your best self. Often it's a social environment or something that makes you feel at peace and also energized. I think of the song form of this is there's a song called Perpetual Mobile by Penguin Cafe Orchestra, which I love. We played it at our wedding. I think United used it as a theme song like 20 years ago, which kind of cheapens it for me, but it has this wonderful feeling of like excitement and also deep permanence and calmness at the same time. And that's to me what resonance is. A hollow thing is something that after you do it, you feel regret. And a Resonant thing, after you do it, you feel nourished. It's a thing that you're proud to have done. They superficially look very similar. It's only in taking a step back or thinking about the indirect implications that you can distinguish the two of them. And modern society, technology, business, politics is all about creating hollow experiences. AI is about to come in and supercharge all of this. I'm actually hugely optimistic about the power of LLMs. But also think the default way they will be applied will be to create even more hollow experiences even faster. A bunch of folks together, we got together and we wrote this manifesto because we think that now is the time with AI that humanity is on sort of the precipice. If we go down and accelerate this humanifying, that's not a word, trend away towards hollowness, or we could use the power of LLMs and other new technologies and technological architectures to pull us towards this resonant, deeply human future. So I think that that's one of the reasons we want to write this down. We want to put a stake in the ground of like, whatever ChatGPT is doing, where it's an organization, a multinational organization creating a thing that appears and pretends to be your best friend, but is actually acting in the corporation's best interests and has incentives that are inherently and must be different from yours, that's extremely compelling. Like, that's not it. That's a hollow experience. That's an experience that gives you this superficial feeling. Like I was talking to somebody like, oh yeah, people love using ChatGPT as a therapist. I was like, yeah, one of the reasons to do that is because real therapists tell you things you don't want to hear. And like, it's the, versus a thing that's going to tell you, oh, what an astute observation. And you're right. You are the hero in this story. Of course, the people like talking to that kind of thing. I do too, but that's not what helps me grow as a human being and as a father and as a citizen and as a member of this community. So I don't know. I think it's just important now to lay the stake in the ground now.
It's absolutely. I was playing with OpenClaw, this new agent that everybody is talking about playing with, and I had forgotten that the agents I use to code, I give it a set of instructions that tell it to not be sycophantic, to not praise me and not, that I want somewhat of an equal partnership and I want it to do this thing. And I give it a story on how I want to behave. But this, OpenClaw was a new system. It's this agent that everyone's talking about. And I hooked it up to my various different things. I hooked it up to GitHub. And I gave it a token and everything else. And then it, says, oh, well, you were GitHub user 76. And then it goes on and on, praising me and talking about all this stuff and going on and on. And I'm just at first it felt great. At first it felt like, oh, wow, look at that. It recognized me and it found something positive to say. But if I were then to take that and talk to it about relationships, it feels like it has all the knowledge in the world. And yet it's not optimized for this resonant. It's not optimized for this idea of making you feel better. It's optimized for what is the most pleasurable response and what is the thing that keeps you most engaged.
And critically, this is a thing that happened in an open source, bottoms up, emergent thing. This is not something that requires some greedy executive somewhere ooh,
there's no company behind it.
It's just the thing that people like to share is partially that makes them feel good. I think there is a big distinction, by the way. This is one of the reasons I don't like chatbots as a formulation, as a UI formulation for LLMs. I love LLMs. I hate chatbots. Those are two strong statements and I feel somewhere in between. But because chatbots fall into this anthropomorphizing so immediately. I think of Claude Code, for example. It's a chat, but really the point of the chat is to create something fundamental and concrete that you care about. And so the chat is merely a means to an end. Whereas a chatbot as a UI, the point is the chat, and that becomes kind of like a party trick that's very easy for you to get stuck in and think of, oh, it has this opinion. I think that chat will be a modality that will be in lots of different experiences, but I care much more about the things like the Claude Codes. Claudebot is interesting in that it's fascinating, in that it's what if you unleashed AI, it worked just for you, and you felt that you had ownership over it in a way that you don't, in a way of OpenAI or some other entity with their agents running on your stuff. And it allowed you to work on your data no matter where it is across all of these different silos and just go crazy. How cool would that be? And of course, it also shows us, and catastrophically dangerous, actually.
Yes.
And so the question is, how do you make that last part go away and capture this as a thing that helps you achieve your aspirations and your goals? And that needs to be some of the things we put in the Resonant Computing Manifesto are 5 kind of concrete characteristics of these kinds of systems. The first is they're private, that they are, whoever holds the context holds the power. And so it has to be something that aligns with your interests and aspirations. Two, it's dedicated. You know it works for you. It doesn't have a conflict of interest. OpenClaw plausibly actually can work for you. So like it's interesting that in some ways the default manifestation of it accidentally can undermine that by having being too sycophantic. It must be plural. There must be no center of power that requires a single point that can't be routed around, so that you can swap between different providers or whatever. They can't hold your data hostage, because once you do, you become captured by their incentives. They have a lot of control over you. It has to be adaptable and open-ended. I think that's one of the things that OpenClaw shows is the power of an open-ended system where no one can really say no. It's, again, messy and dangerous by default, but also this, what are people using it for, and what kinds of neat things happen, and things that go against the business models of some of the service providers that you use, but are in your interest. And the fifth thing is they're pro-social, that it's something that helps you not just be a better island unto yourself, but be better embedded in the fabric of society. Because it turns out that none of us could be separated from society. We are all embedded in a fabric together, and there's a push and pull of that is what makes us strong as individuals and as an overall community and society. And so you have to have something that brings you into that pro-social interactions with others, as opposed to, I've got mine, I'm in a fortress, everyone go away, I'll stab you if you try to get in here. You can accidentally fall into with other technological approaches, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. The one of the really good things that I felt looking at the Resonant Computing Manifesto and the coalition that you've built behind it, and why I was, really honored that you asked me to sign it, is that you brought together all sorts of other people. There's Tim O'Reilly, Bruce Schneider, Lawrence Lessig, Audrey Tang, and Neil Dash, Clay Shirky, and thousands of other people who are coming in and putting a stake in the ground, which says, no, this is the industry we want to work. This is the technology we want to build. This is the kind of organizations, institutions, and this is the impact we want to have on the world. That it isn't just about, can we make a lot of money, or can we, move fast and break things, or can we, have software and now AI eat the world? But like, what is it that we want to do? And in some ways, it felt like trying to build a progressive coalition that's an alternative to sort of the all-in bros, like this sort of the MAGA tech, VCs and a few of these CEOs who are trying to reshape Silicon Valley and tech as this weirdly, like, they call themselves libertarian, but they love authoritarians. Like,
those things don't go together, are supposed to go together, but they do, apparently.
Yeah, it's like, I know Bitcoin folks who are like, no central banks and everything else. And then they were like, the US government's going to set up a national Bitcoin reserve. And I'm like, you've been spending the last 15 years talking about the problems with these centralized authorities and the way in which this power could be abused. And then you get offered the power and all of a sudden you're like, no, I want to embrace it. So I wonder if you could just talk about almost the struggle for what is the politics of Silicon Valley, the politics of tech, or how do we talk about it? How do we advocate for progressive technology?
Yeah, it's interesting that you put it in an explicitly political frame, because I view it as almost orthogonal to the normal red and blue politics in some way. Like, it's another angle on it. I have this essay I wrote.
It's not like American electoral politics,
Right? It's like a what is the good life kind of sense. And I have this essay I wrote a few years ago that's like one of the weirder essays I've written, and also one of the ones that's the second most popular after the Slime one. And it's about the Sarumans and the Radagasts. And everyone loves the Lord of the Rings reference. And it's about two different types of real magic that make the world go round. And so in this essay, sort of draw out two different archetypes that work for totally different game theoretic reasons that have a massive impact on the world. The first archetype is the Saruman. And the Saruman this is Saruman before Lord of the Rings. So industrious wizard before the fall. And it's somebody who, one, believes in the great man theory of history, that history is principally driven forward by a small number of people who are just exceptionally better than others. 2, they believe that they themselves are a great man. And 3, they have enough initial success that leads others to believe that they might be a great man too. And this can become a self-reinforcing reality distortion field that actually does put a dent in the universe. And it's driven entirely by a complete and total absence of self-doubt. Just a world of like, this is the way the world should be. I don't have to think about it. I should be in charge. They're so lucky. I'm the only one that can fix it. And, a number of people that we've celebrated in Silicon Valley lore, like Steve Jobs is an example that a lot of people respect, who is unambiguously a Saruman. You also, of course, I didn't have to name some of the other ones. You can immediately jump to, there's any number of them. And I'd argue that Sarumans are having a field day nowadays. The second archetype is the Radagast. And we don't talk about these very often, although you've mentioned a few already in this chat. And the Radagast is somebody whose magic works for a totally different reason. It's somebody who sees the seeds of greatness in everything and everyone around them. Not saying that they think everything is great, but they can find the little points of greatness and help grow those into something that's much larger than the sum of its parts. So a Radagast is much more of a gardener. It's somebody who helps build something bigger together than what it could have been done alone. Stuart Brand is a great example of this. When I actually wrote the essay, I had very few examples. And then over the last few years, I've added more and more and more. That section's gotten longer. But Gandhi is a Radagast, for example. And you have all these other people that create value much larger than themselves. Stuart Brand, like the Scenius, anyone who believes in Scenius and helping create this bottom-up emergent thing is a Radagast. And I would argue that is the major schism. Does this centralized Saruman worldview of there's a small number of people who are inherently better than everybody else and they should just be in charge and be able to do whatever they want. Anybody who gets in their way should be, should just get out of the way because they're a Luddite. Or is it this inclusive bottoms-up view of not saying everything is great and everybody's perfect, but saying that when we are at our best as a species is when we are weaving things together that are better than any of us could have done individually.
We are collaborative, and it's not just the thing. In the Saruman vision, there's an idea that I think that the people who see themselves that way, they see themselves as anti-authoritarian, they see themselves as libertarian, they see themselves as trying to rebel against these institutional constraints that prevent innovation and social change. Yet, because of the nature of this, great hero theory, they very quickly see themselves moving into this role. I saw that as sort of being connected to the creation of Twitter, where there was this massive debate about, and super intense interest in the founding story. Who were the founders? And the story is super messy. There's people who were founders who weren't named founders and weren't founders and were named founders. And the truth of the matter is all of the interesting stuff happened as a community of people that came together, and that I'm not sure any of the founders that were put on the thing even believe that about themselves. Yet the hero's myth pushed people to say, these are the great people, Jack Dorsey is a friend, and he's someone who people see as this, Steve Jobsian style thing. And then you look at how he leads an organization and works on an organization and collaborates with people, and he's a lot more like Yoda than Steve Jobs. Yeah. And you're like, okay, this guy meditates a lot and is mostly about finding other people and giving them enough space and direction and everything else so that you can cultivate a community of creativity. And it's just such a fascinating dynamic because in some ways it's so different than what people from the outside think the dynamics and struggles are.
I think it's the point about Saruman's, they're like, those other authoritarians, they're all bad. And so I should
But I'm good.
And it's like, well, wait a second. Everybody says that. It's like, everyone agrees, like, okay, we all agree that the people in charge are bad, right? Like, and at the same time, everyone goes, and that means that, and they all say, I should be in charge. Like, wait. And it becomes a power struggle of seeing which ones get the compounding effects and kind of be put in the position of God, Emperor, or whatever. One of the tricks, you never see yourself as a villain because, of course, if the company you're part of is doing villainous things, even accidentally, what does it say about you? Are we the baddies? That's impossible to imagine. So one of the tricks I would do at Google when people would propose something that I thought was like a horrendous, like this product category is like unbelievably creepy and gross and should not exist, I would say, hey, do me a favor. Imagine that product if Facebook shipped it. They go, I hate it. I'm like, cool. Let's take it as a given. It's a feel about us. But you can't see that when you're inside of it. You're like, no, I'm good. and everyone here is good. Therefore, this thing that we're part of is good. The power dynamics just emerge in a way that, like, this is one of the reasons, privilege is another example of this. When you are the beneficiary of a power dynamic, it's completely invisible to you. It's just, no, I'm just really funny. Everyone likes my jokes. It's like, no, you're a billionaire, and everyone knows that. And so, and you're a little bit funny, but like, and so you just don't even see it. And so that means that you come to think, oh, I don't really have that much power. It's like, yeah, you do, actually. In a lot of these cases, it's just amazing to watch how blind people are to their own power.
It's incredibly hard to see that dynamic. It's incredibly hard to understand it and get perspective on it. And we have everybody, like, as these folks become wealthier and more powerful, there's incentive of everyone around them to deny the existence of that dynamic.
And someone described this to me, by the way, as the money disease. I think it's such an interesting frame because it gets in a position where you can be like a saint and be in that position, and it will over time contort you because you have no shortage of people who would like to be in your inner circle. So you don't have to ice anybody out. You just, who's the next person who's going to fly in my private plane? Well, that one person didn't really seem to get my jokes. I just don't think she's got a good vibe. So, like, let's get that guy who always laughs when, like, I don't know, he's fun, It's like, yeah, because he laughs at your shit. So, like, you get stuck in this thing where you have an infinite supply of sycophants. Someone pointed out that now with LLMs, we all
just
have
like AI.
Yeah, exactly. Now we all have an infinite supply of sycophants. So we can all have money disease, but, without the money part. So, great.
Yeah. At one point, I had this idea of Silicon Valley as I was trying to figure out the politics of Silicon Valley, and I called it libertarian social democracy. It's like... because Silicon Valley in the Bay Area, they vote for Democrats. Like, not even close. But it's a different kind of social democracy. It's a very different kind of politics than the rest of the world, because you do want to be able to be a disruptor. You want to be able to change the world. You want to be able to raise money and start, be successful and go public and give. But it's also employee ownership, because you give stock options to everyone, and it's inconceivable that you aren't an employee owned company, and yet it's also super capitalist. It's a fascinating dynamic.
It is such an interesting combination. And it's so funny to me. One of my favorite classes I took in college was the socio-techno history of Silicon Valley. And like, I'm learning in these other classes about, these proofs and like, this is the way that this proof works and this computer science result. And over here, I'm learning about the story of the controversy behind that proof. And you can't use a computer to help prove the four-color theorem or whatever. All these history, and like, I wasn't really aware of it. I was awash in this, but I didn't understand what the hacker ethic was. I intuitively felt it and cared about it. What someone at Google told me once, brilliant person, they told me, Alex, if a problem can't be understood via computer science, it's either unknowable or unimportant. And I was like, well, what are you talking about? Like, it was just...
That is the most Google statement ever.
Right? I mean, and so, of course, it explains like this. And computer science is an enormously powerful lens where it applies. And there's lots of things that cannot be understood via computer science and also still matter. And also, we can't know them to the same level of precision that we can understand certain things in computer science. And also, we can understand them like better than chance. And that's better than nothing if they're extremely high leverage. And so it was just this view in Silicon Valley. But I've always been drawn to the combination, which funnily is, I guess, famously true for Steve Jobs, about the humanities and computer science and the intersection. How do you use these technological leverage to create these really human results and I think technology is one of the best levers ever to just extend and have good things applied. And also, they just multiply whatever you apply them to. So it's really important you apply them to something that you're proud of and that you think has the right long-term implications.
I mean, especially things with software. I mean, we have this dynamic where, because software is infinitely replicable, like unlike building a bridge or a building where you might have the plans to build it or the designs for clothing, where you still have to follow the pattern to make the clothing. In software, because of the universal machine and the way that we do computation and everything else, you get one version of the application, the software, and there's no difference of me handing it out to others. And which is why we have open source technology, which is saying that since there's no cost to me to giving it to you, I should contribute back to this larger world. It's also, there's the Mark Andreessen essay, software eating the world, which is this concept that because software is this universal machine, because it is universally replicable, because once you're able to do the work one place, you can apply it everywhere else, that it is in many ways, when it comes to society and the economy, very different. And therefore, even more important that these businesses that are remaking society and the economy are pro-social.
Another way of putting this is like atoms are just many orders of magnitude harder than bits. And sometimes I look at the tech industry and we're all like patting ourselves on the back, like, wow, look at all this leverage. And like, my dudes, like the atoms are just many orders of magnitude harder than bits. And we're just playing on easy a little bit. That's one of the reasons you can see these effects club so quickly. I love your point about open source being fundamentally enabled by the non-rival nature of data. Like data, code is just a specific form of data that is in a specific format that can be executed. LLMs now mean that we're way more forgiving about what things can be executed because now we have a universal machine effectively. But this means too that you can copy data at full fidelity, basically instantly. And that has all kinds of implications. That's also one of the reasons, by the way, privacy is a challenging topic, is because no system really today has grappled with the idea that data is inherently non-rivalrous, which means as soon as it's out of your sight, off of your turf, out of your control, you can't say anything about what happens to it on a technical level because someone could replicate it, they could store it, they could pass it on to somebody else, they could pass it on to themselves in the future by storing it, they can do whatever they want with that data. And that is a blessing and a curse. I would also point out that, by the way, the tech industry for the last 30 years is entirely predicated. The entire business model for the vast majority of the Silicon Valley is based on this idea: you make useful software, which is expensive and hard, and then can be replicated ad nauseum into a market where if you have enough people that need exactly the same thing, and then they store their data in your thing, on your cloud, and it's yours. And you as a company can hold on to it for them. It makes it harder and harder for them to leave. And sometimes you can do aggregations over that data to produce useful signals that you can sell on to others or back to those users. But this moat over data is what is the thing that leads to this extremely strong thing. I would argue that LLMs now break that first part because Clay Shirky has this notion of the Coasian theory of the firm, Coasian theory of software, I think is his frame. And this notion of like, there's certain amounts of software that just are below the Coasian floor. Like they're just not worth it to be built by any software organization. And now in a world of LLMs, the like smallest possible niche, it can all get built. All of it can. And that is radically different. I was talking to somebody a couple of days ago who was pitching me this little startup, and they were talking about making software, make PMs faster at producing, reviewing the software produced by engineers, because now engineers can use vibe coding, so it's so much faster. And it's like, I think you're trying to make faster horses. This entire thing kind of falls apart. The whole like socio-techno-industrial complex around producing software that is the same for lots of different people is predicated on the idea of software being expensive to generate. And if software isn't expensive to generate, that kind of undermines the entire dynamic in a way that I think this is one of the reasons I want to write to pull together the Resonant Computing Manifesto now, is this is massively scrambling the power dynamics, I think. And so if you're going to have a thing that sort of like messes with all the power dynamics in the industry, now is the time to say, okay, let's go back and reclaim the hacker ethic, because in the chaos that's going to come out of this in the software industry, like let's plan it so at least it's pro-social or in line with human flourishing. And get back to that as opposed to just continuing this old.
That brings up such an interesting thing, which is we have this relatively recent, this big collapse in the stock prices of SaaS businesses, the very model of technology businesses. We have different kinds of big technology businesses, but one of them was predicated on ads. This is most of Google's business, most of Meta's business, a huge number of these sort of Amazon, which is actually a huge ad company, even though they do a bunch of other things. And then you have a whole world of technology businesses that are predicated on the idea of this moat and this SaaS software that you pay for a monthly thing, the Salesforces of the world. And now we see in a world where the AI is, the agentic programming is going to come in and basically undermine what was oddly enough one of the more socially responsible business models for the tech industry.
It undermines the one that actually is like plausibly is like creating net value for society. Vertical SaaS businesses are, someone described it once as like a spreadsheet in a trench coat. It's really not that much. It's just specific to that particular vertical. And one of the reasons though it works is because you actually do, if I'm running a gym, instead of like 3 or 4 gyms in my local area, I don't want to think about the right way of doing timesheets and marketing promotions or whatever. I want the best practices of what everybody else is doing just in a button where I can focus on running my business locally. And that does create economic and societal value, I think. And also, so much of the industry is about capturing data and moats around data. And that's not obvious. It's like one of those things that's like a layer below the main dynamics. But like that is fundamentally, and by the way, that's enabled by what's called the same origin paradigm, which I would describe as the laws of physics that we've used for 30 years now in the web and now apps. That is what allowed cloud computing to go big, allowed Web 2.0. And it's also what leads to these silos that greedily optimize the data and become bigger and bigger and bigger aggregators, is all downstream of the security model, which, by the way, was a hotfix in 1994. Netscape had, after it added JavaScript, it had cookies. Someone goes, oh shit, someone could get a cookie from one domain to the other. Where should we allow it to be sent? And the obvious answer is not so much a domain, because there's a few random little rules about what makes an origin versus domain. And then you plop that in there. And now as you add more web standards and you need some kind of boundary between different places, which one should you pick? I'll pick the one that we've already been using, the origin. That's fine. And so
so much of the technology is driven by just sort of the momentum around it. This moment we have right now, and I talked to Neil Dash, who I'm pretty sure signed the Resonant Computing. I talked to him very recently, and he talked about AI as normal technology, not this sort of magical, Lord of the Rings ring that is a power over everything, but it is a normal, powerful, transformative technology that has the same normal economic and social dynamics around it. And, it has around it. And I think that that's actually a really important thing to think of. It's very powerful technology, and it's super interesting to do it and how it works, but we stay the same. And if we think about the technology adoption and profoundly powerful technology adoptions, think about the introduction of the steam engine and the introduction of factories that led to the idea of the Luddites. And we have this popular conception that Luddites were anti-technology, but that's not who the Luddites were. The Luddites were against the idea of child labor. They were against the idea of people being driven off their land to have to go work in these factories. They were against the idea of working 14, 16-hour days with no breaks. They were against the idea of unsafe working conditions that didn't pay you enough to live a dignified life. And if we think of AI as being one of the potentially most transformative technologies we've developed, I think looking back at the introduction of the factory, of the steam engine, is very similar. And so we need to think about, it isn't just a rejection of all of this technology, but it is for whom, by whom, under what conditions, and how do we construct and build a social movement for how we use this AI that isn't going to lead us to being sort of disempowered factory workers in
increasing cacophony.
Industrial revolution.
Yeah. My good friend Anthea Roberts has this frame of like, if thinking now is 10 times cheaper, do you think 10 times faster, or do you think 10 times deeper? And I think the default answer is faster. And that leads to more superficial, faster OODA loops, Red Queen race, everybody rushing to get an edge, but staying in the same place and getting more and more tired. And when you think deeper, you can have richer thoughts and you can understand things from different angles. And I was talking to somebody who is using LLMs to do creative writing projects for the first time in 15 years. Haven't done a creative writing project since, college. And it's a way for her to work through some personal things she's going through. And that lens of seeing how these characters she creates interact in this environment helps her understand. It's like playing with a Ouija board and seeing what you believe kind of thing. And she's able to do that because LLMs have made the process of actually writing and exploring these themes a lot easier. Not that it's going to be the next great novel necessarily, but for her, it's extraordinarily meaningful and an extraordinarily meaningful part of her understanding of herself. And I think that LLMs have the potential to do that. And the default of using them to make memes even faster and ever more cacophonous information just assaulting our senses is not the way to do that. And so how do you make these cozy communities, these places where you can have meaningful interactions with people you care about or extend your horizons? And I think LLMs are great at that. One thing that they do, a couple of ways of thinking about them. One, they have infinite patience. They have human level baseline reasoning, but infinite patience. That means that they give you abundant cognitive labor. We've had abundant mechanical labor for a very long time. It's much easier to build a house now when you got a forklift and whatever. And now we have abundant cognitive labor. And that can be great. That can be amazing. Like if you have that working for you and in your interests and aspirations. It can also be not good for you if you have something that's working to create a dossier on you and how to manipulate you or how best to be a better customer for the corporation as opposed to the best version of yourself. Those two things are distinct, and they must fundamentally be distinct because the thing that's good for the corporation is obviously not the thing that's going to be the best for me. Obviously and straightforwardly, that must be true. How do you use the power of AI, unleash it for your interests, align with your aspirations? That's the real trick. And by the way, this does not require, it's funny, I talk to people I describe who are nervous about AI and nervous about the implications. And we had this discussion about what I would call like vegan models versus factory farmed models. And they had this thing about like, oh, I could only use models that were definitely trained on, I know, where everyone was fairly compensated for all the work and with only, high quality inputs or whatever. And I said, that sounds like a vegan model. Like, it's great. And also, we got these factory farmed models sitting here, which are like kind of ick about how they were produced. And yet they're sitting here, given that they're produced, I'm not going to stop them from being produced. They already exist. They already have been produced. You can do, 100x beyond what you can with some of those models. How can you take those inputs and create the most, societal benefit and value creation with these tools? And I think you can do it. It's amazing to me. I told Dan Tipper this a year ago or so. One of the things I'm most thankful for the way it turned out. Can you imagine if ChatGPT would have come out before OpenAI decided to open up their API? If they had, they would have said, oh, that's a proprietary thing only for us. Like, of course you would. That's duh. If you have this breakout product, and nobody else would have felt compelled to do it or whatever. But by just pure historical happenstance, the API was already open before ChatGPT became a thing. And now you just take for granted that there's a dozen or so extremely high quality models competing on cost and quality, and that you can take LLMs for granted as a commodity. That's awesome. That's like saying
we swap in and out between them all.
It's amazing. It's amazing. And it's like LLM's electricity, right? If the chatbot that owns all my memories and I'm tied to that, that's very different than the electricity provider under the covers. I can swap with that cell phone carrier. I don't know. I can swap between AT&T and T-Mobile in an hour. It's okay. It doesn't matter. And that is just a radically better position for society. And it makes me very optimistic that we have the materials necessary to do some really cool stuff that don't need anything else to happen. I don't need any other business incentives to change. I don't need anybody else to make some new revolutionary technology. This stuff is so stupid powerful. The overhang of capability is so significant that we could metabolize and use this stuff as a raw input to create value for society for decades to come, only with how it exists today,
In many ways that the API for OpenAI launched before ChatGPT, and we, I don't know if people know this, but ChatGPT was kind of a random experiment. It was not a planned thing. It was just oh, I wonder if we throw up a chatbot and see what happens. And then it blew up. It is in many ways similar to some of the decisions that led to the open web. We talked about this, the way in which cookies work, the way in which HTML works, the way in which links work. The first proposals for the web that would be, under Xanadu, this sort of hypertext thing was that they had to be two directional and you had to have approval for them and every page was editable.
And keep them in sync and all of this.
Yeah. And Tim Berners-Lee thought that when he invented the web, that was the quick and dirty version. And then he spent decades trying to invent the right version with the semantic web, which never took off. But the thing that scared me when OpenAI went and drove this was the lack of open source models, the lack of competition, the lack of things. And it was if there's a way in which you have an incredibly powerful technology that is held by just a few people, it is bad for society.
Right. It's a centralizing force because now you all got to go through this one. And if they don't like the way that you talked about them in the thing, you know what? Actually, your API doesn't work anymore. Sorry. But being in a position that looks superficially very similar, but you have a number of models that are arguably better in various dimensions is you only need a few actors to be in equilibrium state to cause a stable equilibrium to be radically different than the alternative. And the fact that we have this sort of the stalemate almost that keeps on going up, and also creating space for open models to, they'll take longer to get there. But after a certain amount of time, these models, again, have so much excess capacity. The frontier models are talking about making it 10 times better. It's like, it's already 1,000 times better than I need it. If I use it for properly small scoped things, it is already way beyond what I need, which means I can rely on the best open source model right now because I don't need it to do that much. I am asking it to make very straightforward little decisions instead of a much larger scaffold. If you want them to be omniscient chatbots that know everything, then you need to be this insane, perfect quality or whatever. And like, if you relax that constraint, you can get them to, like, you can just do wild things with them today.
And, it's this thing where the open models are, 6 months after the others. And that's amazing. One of the things that I think was super interesting is we know that technology has cycles. We know that the way in which new technology is adopted and plays out in the marketplace has cycles. The history doesn't repeat itself so much as it rhymes. And I want to get back to some of the work that you did with the open web platform, which was Google deciding that its business model wasn't based on closed type systems. It wasn't based on an app store that had strict access permissions. And, I know you didn't work on it, but like Android isn't closed source the way iOS is. And in fact, Android, Google provides the Google Play Store in a very similar way to the App Store from Apple. But you can install apps yourself. You can run your own. And, my own app, Divine, we're first releasing it on this thing called Zapstore, which is a Nostr-based app store first. And we will go to Google Play, but we wanted to show, appreciate.
There are others. It's possible.
There are other alternatives. And so I wonder if you could talk about the way in which your work with open web platforms and building open web really led to a solidification of the open internet, of these, billions of web pages and multiple browsers and open source browsers, because, Chrome is based on Chromium, which is this open source browser that almost everyone uses. And that history is what we use with Divine and Nostr and Blue Skies with that, app protocol. But what can you learn from that to think about the era of AI? Having built what makes the open web live.
I think you're giving me too much credit, but working on the open web team, what became the Blink rendering engine team after we decided to fork WebKit to Blink, was one of the highlights of my career. I think will always will be, because I've never been in an environment where the thing I morally cared about, open systems that didn't have centralized points of control, directly lined up with my day job, which the remit, the goal was make the open web as powerful and successful and diverse an ecosystem as possible. And the reason that was a good idea for Google is if the web is open-ended and messy and exuberant and wild, and then you need a guide to help you make sense of it. And we make the best guide. And so it had an amazing complementary alignment. The fact of Google search is not, if you look at an app store delivery model, the app store model is fundamentally load bearing in the security model. You have to have an app store that has special privileges that you can affirmatively say the user was not tricked into installing this app and did it intentionally. The open web's model is all about assuming content is actively malicious. That's the security model. And so the worst that content should be able to do is it should be able to waste your CPU cycles and flash your screen, which if you have epilepsy, for example, is pretty significant. But everything outside of that, it can't really harm you. It can't reach outside of that sandbox. And that's one of the reasons it has such low friction. The superpower of the web is you click a link and you teleport instantly to it, and it's safe. That's insane. That's a wild thing. And that's possible because of a security model that allows, if you assume the content is malicious and yet it's still safe to teleport, you can enable this thing that needs no gatekeepers. And that's amazing. And I find that ethos of the web, that importance of it. One of the things, one of my proudest sort of accomplishments is when we decided to fork WebKit to Blink, which was the right call to do. I was there and helping make that decision. And one of the things I thought was really important was us establishing a new process for launching web standards. And so at the time, a couple of weeks before we announced the fork, actually, we announced a new launch process that was, we had API owners, we called them, people who had been in the code base of Chromium, and also deliberately included some non-Google employees as people who were elders of this ecosystem. And their job was to be stewards of, is this a thing that we are proud of in the long-term time horizon that we think is helping the open web ecosystem work successfully? And so we committed to this process where each of these decisions had to be made publicly in a world where anybody could weigh in on it. And I designed it specifically so if we did something bad that went against the interest of the open web and clearly was something that was just self-dealing, that we made it very easy for TechCrunch and Hacker News and whatever to point out that we were going against our stated principles. And that was a deliberate decision. If you're locked inside of a room with an 800-pound gorilla and the 800-pound gorilla says, trust me, you should get the fuck out of the room because that gorilla could kill you intentionally or unintentionally. If, however, that same gorilla locks themselves to the wall and allows you to a third party to audit that it's actually a real thing and they don't have a key and they show, here's where I can collaborate with you and say, let's collaborate right here at the edge. Then you can collaborate with them because game theoretically, they've kicked off the worst case scenarios. And so I wanted to demonstrate that we were not forking WebKit to Blink to have some undue influence over the web, but specifically to embody our ideals in this process. And I'm just over the moon with how well that was received and what a stable staying structure that's had over the years. One of the things we used to talk about with the web, it was this notion of if you had a single platform owned by a single entity, it's not an open system. And everyone has to say, what's the incentives of that entity that owns it? The web platform is, importantly, a implementation from multiple different implementations, all implementing roughly the same thing. If they were implemented as held together by an iron band, where each one had to move in lockstep, then there could be no innovation because the one that has the least interest in advancing it could just sandbag everything and hold
veto everything.
back.
Yeah.
And so what you need is an elastic band. And so each one is voting by which features they ship and decisions they make about where the web should go. And if you go off in this direction, if you pull too far, you break the band. You are now a separate platform and all the benefits of being part of this open system break. But what you want to do is use that stretch in the direction, I think this is what's good for the web. And then if you can convince other browser vendors to also go in that direction because web developers want it, they're shipping content that uses it, that puts a stronger and stronger pull on the laggards. And it's really important to reason about how much stretch you have in the band. So one of the things that we did while I was there, we had a program called predictability. And the idea was there's certain stretch in the band that's not useful. It's not designed to push innovation. It's different in these three browsers for no good reason. And so we would find those. We would find how we could clean up the specs. If the spec was unclear, we'd figure out how we can write better web platform tests that all the browsers could run if it was just an implementation detail. And we tried to make it so that over time, all the browsers were working consistently. So the stretch in the band was all about authentic votes of we believe that this is what is good for the ecosystem. And that's a really complex, nuanced process. But I don't know, I think the web is a great example of that working really well and this being in kind of a stable equilibrium over time that drives innovation.
Yeah, and we now have a world in which it doesn't matter which web browsers you use. If I don't like what, Chrome is doing, I can switch to Firefox or Safari or Edge or whatever the Microsoft one is called.
Although that's using Blink. I mean, so one of the things that I didn't really, it's very important to have a stable equilibrium of diversity of these.
Then we ended up getting a common core.
Yeah. And it turns out that we made a project that people felt good about the way it was being run. And then that became a thing that Opera and Microsoft and others we'll just do that. It's oh, wait a second. I actually think it's healthy for you guys to still have your own rendering engine. But so in some ways it was too successful and it became kind of like this open ecosystem. When an open ecosystem become a truly open thing, you could argue how open Chromium is. There's a spectrum. Linux is more open than Chromium. Chromium is definitely more open than Android. Android is way more open than iOS. And it all comes down to, if you look at any point in the stack, is there a point where one entity could make a decision that could screw over the ecosystem if they went greedy, incompetent, lazy, or evil? And how bad would it be? So iOS, if Apple decided, you know what, screw it. Only companies that exactly directly fit with our thing are allowed in the App Store, they could do it. They could absolutely
there's nothing
do it.
you do. There's no legal restraints on it. There's nothing.
And on the web, that's not true because the web fundamentally embodied, to my understanding, even in case law, is your browser's got to render the same content the same way. It's got to render it it's got to be the window where the web page shows up should be effectively just faithfully rendering the pixels served by that site and provided, maybe modified by the user's own user agent modifications in the form of extensions. But it can't play winners and losers about which ones can do what. That's fundamentally against the model of the web. And I don't know, I just think that the web is one of those things. I was talking to somebody today. They said, I'm just feeling so I feel like the web has lost. And and I said, if the people I would be quaking in my boots is if I had an app platform today, because in a world of LLMs and infinite software, apps are too chonky. They're too big. They're the equilibrium point of how big a piece of software is tied to how hard is it to produce and how hard is it to distribute. And apps are hard to produce as hard as any software, and they're hard to distribute because it costs $8 an install, for a consumer install to drive that distribution. And so web actually is a much better toolkit for making these little chunks of software that can be embedded in others. So I think the web is going to be the underlying medium for the next wave of software in a way that I'm excited about. It never went away. It was always there, with the potential to blossom into something new with the right environment.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've been doing with Divine, this Vine Revival social video app, is quite literally trying to think of it as, in some ways, a social media browser. Because yes, we have the browser on top of everything else, but it's all built on open protocols, all built on open standards, and built on open source. And so one of the things that happened is we put up our servers but we put up the documentation on how the API works. And some kid came along and wrote an intermediary server layer to make the original Vine app work with the Divine servers.
That's cool.
So you can jailbreak an old iPhone and install the IPA app and, add the settings that redirect the domain names. And then all of a sudden it all works.
That's cool.
And that couldn't happen without an open ecosystem.
Yeah.
If we didn't have an open protocol, if we had just said, here, we're building a centralized system that's just like Instagram, but different content rules on AI, and we've got these old videos back, then we wouldn't be opening up that ecosystem, and we wouldn't be taking advantage of the open nature of it that doesn't require you to ask for permission.
Permissionless innovation.
Yeah.
Architecture for participation, as Tim O'Reilly would say. I have this deck about gardening platforms that I did a few years ago that I'm pretty proud of. It's very long. It's like a textbook kind of thing. And it talks about the power dynamics of platforms. Why are they valuable? How do they evolve? How do you think about evolving them in a strategic direction? And one of the challenges of an open system, or really any platform, is it's a coordination problem to change APIs. Once you have people who use them, now if you change it, you break them. And then people who are have a thing that is working, they'd really rather you not touch it, actually. And so how do you balance this innovation at the same time as keeping this compatibility? And open systems can sometimes be extremely hard to navigate for precisely that reason, because if you tweak this thing, you hear billions of web pages kind of break.
That's what happened to ActivityPub and the Fediverse in Mastodon. Is now you have this coordination problem where in order to build on top of it, it becomes really difficult. And I've seen that building Divine, where I looked at the Nostr servers and the way in which they use WebSockets and the way in which they structured data, and it worked at some level so well. It's so amazing. And then I needed aggregate data. I needed not to request every comment to give you the comment count thing. I needed the ability to record ephemeral data around views that had some privacy protection. And I had all of the things. And in order to do them, I couldn't do the Nostr WebSocket way of things. I had to use a RESTful endpoint so I could do caching. So now I have a system where I've built the software so it is fully backward compatible. You can use it on any Nostr server and it works. But because those other servers don't include the enhancements, that stretching the rubber band, as you described, they're not going to work as well. That profile page is going to take 10 seconds instead of 1 second.
Right.
And it's very hard because, I had this debate with Moxie Marlinspike, who created Signal, where Moxie believed in open networks and open source and open protocols, yet also was like, look, the only way I make Signal fast and reliable and private is here's the source code, but I'm going to run my version, and my version is just going to interact with my stuff. And it's not part of an open network. And, it is telling that we have Signal today as an open source messaging platform that works. And the federated standard-based alternatives, XMPP and Matrix and all of the protocols, were never able to do the innovation in enough way to get that to happen. It's a tricky balance.
It's fundamentally a balance. And I think I sometimes say people only see the downside of one, or like, open systems are so hard or so fundamentally messy, or the proprietary thing is fundamentally centralized control. And there is a contextual balance, I think, that rides that line, because you get benefits from each. And how do you balance that overall thing and make it so that it is possible to fork that ecosystem if necessary? Like, that's one of the reasons of something being open source is in the Signal example is way better than not being open source. Because if enough people go, you know what, screw this example, we're all going to do our own thing and coordinate over here and have this other version of doing it. You could, it's possible. And it's not necessarily it's easy. The easier it is the more that's well documented. Like Chromium is an open source project. It's all there. Whereas Android is much more thrown over the wall, once a year with a cleaned up release. And whereas Chromium, I used to delight in the fact that we had just so much stuff happening in the open source repo that engineers should be like, is it okay if I put this detail? It's like, nobody's going to see it. It's fine. Just comment, just tell the whole thing, use the code name. It's fine. That was actually really nice because every so often what would happen is 3 years later, someone would say, well, so Apple's really fast at this thing. And I'd say, oh, really? Because here's a comment from literally 3 years ago where we told them that their methodology was flawed and they were only measuring the underlying performance of core animation as opposed to their rendering engine. And it's there. It's gone to the amber and you can see that it was actually 3 years ago. This isn't like a thing I just, pull out of my hat because right in that moment. And so you could take advantage of the fact that it was all in public. And that means that it's easier to fork, which is one of the reasons you don't have to fork it. Because you could. I don't know, it's got all the machinery there and it does provide some really powerful balance. I think I'm always thinking about how do you balance this open systems and these potential of things that can provide a coherent, distilled, easy to use experience and ride that line. And how do you get the evolutionary open-ended system? Because Google search is also an evolutionary open-ended system. For a long time, it was primarily, and you can still think of it this way, it's just a distillation of the link stream, the query stream, and the click stream, and a distillation that uses some really surprisingly simple asymmetries. This is a stylized example. This is never literally how it worked. But you can imagine if you want to show images in the search results, one way of doing this, is to say, given the query images of foo, trigger, no matter what foo is, because obviously they want images. But most users don't do that. So another thing you can do is say, given the query foo, check in the last 90 days, how many individuals have searched for images of foo and how many individuals have searched for foo, divide it, and if it hits some threshold, then trigger. And that's it. That's the entire
Show them images.
And that is a self-balancing, self-aligning metric, because if you have a new term you've never seen before, one of the first users will get frustrated, not get images, and go, images of. And if it's a new term that we've never seen before, then that quickly gets above the threshold, and it can stay above the threshold as it's going, and you get the self-balancing thing very automatically. And so those are evolutionary systems that harness the power of evolution inside of a set of very small number of rules that then allow them to grow and change and evolve and improve automatically from the activities of the ecosystem. So I'm obsessed with those kinds of things that cleverly capture these little asymmetries and play them back in a way that creates societal value.
And, we see that today in algorithms. One of the innovations behind Blue Sky was instead of saying that there's just one set of algorithms or that you have no algorithm whatsoever, they opened up the system and they provided a plugin system by which you can provide and calculate your own algorithms. And, at the time, I don't think they thought it was the biggest feature. I think they thought, that focus was on, composable moderation and the open protocols and everything else. But what users saw was, this empowers me. Now there's 30,000 algorithms I could choose from. And in Divine, it's the same way. I didn't think that filtering out AI slop was going to be the main thing. I was just like, I don't like seeing these videos. And now with the system that I have a say over, I can filter them out. And so I will filter them out for myself, and I will make it possible for other people to filter out. But people could use the Divine app and plug in other servers that don't do the AI filtering. If you want to watch AI things,
go for it. And you can watch where people go. And the fact that people, one of the tests is if someone starts off with something, then changes it, extremely strong signal that they want the other thing. Versus, I don't know, if you give them something like the default thing, they could stay with it. They could love it, or they could be like, whatever. They could not know it's any better. But if you can watch, people are really going over to this other one, that's a good sign that it's onto something. How do we pull that, the insights of that into the default algorithms so that more people don't have to switch because they don't want to switch because it does the right thing for them? And you can do this sometimes. One of the tactics I do in platforms sometimes is I create an escape hatch. The very bottom, you can do everything in an iframe or whatever. And then what you do is you watch in the ecosystem, what are people doing in the escape hatch? And then you build upwards. And your goal is maximize the amount of usage of the product while minimizing the percentage of users that have to drop to the escape hatch to solve their problem. And this formulation gives you a naturally self-steering metric. You watch what people do. You see, where can I factor out what people are doing and get the 80-20 of that and lift it up to another layer? It's technically sugar on top of the underlying thing. And you kind of build up and build up and build up. And you can create more and more value by making it easier and easier to do common things that people care about. And you're creating functionality responding to watching what people actually care about in practice and do. When I went to Larry Rositsky's podcast, he described it as unconventional product advice. because I'm all about like, it's like building an ant colony, you know, it's like not thinking about it as building a cathedral. It's very bizarre and bottom up.
Well, you know, and the funny thing was, you know, watching the early days of Twitter was absolutely not an architected system. It was, you know, the technology was an absolute mess because it was just looking at what people were doing. And everything that we think of as Twitter, as this sort of social media, at replies, using the at in the username, hashtags, trending topics, retweets, what became, you know, tweet streams and Twitter spaces based on Clubhouse. Everything we think of as the platform was created by communities of users and communities of people developing practice. And, you know, I think that is the part that's this emergent hive mind, which is so amazing when it's done well. You worked on the open web. In many ways, we got an open web. We got an internet and a web that wasn't controlled by a single corporation. We didn't end up in the enclosures of a new AOL. It's this new system where a single company runs it. And we do have this sort of part of it around a few very large social media apps and platforms, and we have smartphones that are a more controlled space. But on the whole, the internet we have today is an open and free place because of the technology, because of the protocols and the standards, everything else. And we have AI coming along. What can we learn from the struggles of what gave us the open web in our participation in designing and understanding AI as it gets adopted?
The most important thing is, where does the state accrete? So where does your state as a user accumulate under what? Who gets to see it? Who gets to sort of rent it back to you? And so that's why using OpenAI APIs is radically different than using ChatGPT. Because ChatGPT, that state is on ChatGPT's turf, and it can do whatever it wants.
They have all of your data.
Right? I think of like cloud security as 4 tiers. And this is, you know, a simplification, but each one is an order of magnitude better than the other, than the next. The first one is something like Gmail or ChatGPT. It's a hosted service, and it's you using a service on the service's terms. And it can call whatever rules it wants. It's like couch surfing on a stranger's couch. They can do whatever they want. When you go to the store, they can rifle through your shit, and you can't say no. The next tier up is an order of magnitude better. And this is using it's like renting an apartment in a landlord's building, running a VM in Google Cloud, or using the API for OpenAI that you can swap between different providers.
You have rights of privacy and protection that are in that user agreement that are very different than...
And they sure, they have a key. They can look inside. And also, the terms of service say they won't. And it's in the contract. And they'd be a bad landlord if they did that. The next tier up is trusted execution environments and confidential compute. Taking some of the technology that honestly was developed originally for DRM and using it against, and to allow a federated architecture where you know it's your turf, even though it's running remotely and based on what other people are running. And
so much of design is built on that. The way we do authentication and user key stuff, and the way that we verify that content was actually shot in the camera. And we have this thing called proof mode, which is based on C2PA, which was created as DRM technology built into these devices.
Take the tools of the oppressors, man, and use them to free your data. I didn't know that. That's really cool. And this is the kind of creative, using the pieces on the table and the platforms are available to you, no matter where they came from. How can you use them to do the most good? And these tools that were originally designed for DRM are actually super useful for allowing integrity and sort of ownership of data. So it can be my turf, even though it's in the cloud, and have some real confidence that is true. But
there's one more. There's a better one beyond just
FHE.
You're using it. Yeah.
And so FHE, fully homomorphic encryption, I think of as the volcano layer example or version of this. FHE also is really great. It's often overkill. It's like 1,000, it's 1,000 times better than that first Gmail or ChatGPT layer. It's also really easy to mess up because to do this properly, you have to have, I'm not an expert in this. And so, you have to make sure that you have the consistent timing across all the different branches, for example. And so a lot of FHE deployed things I've seen in practice that aren't demos, mess this up. And you can watch and be like, okay, clearly you just logged
so easy to mess up security.
Yep. And so if you do it wrong, it's okay, actually, you might as well have just done tier 3 and just done TEs, and you would have been in a much better position. But my point, I guess, is that tier 2 is way worse than tier 3, but it's way better than tier 1. And so the environment of I can use, if the LLMs are just an API provider and they're kind of this faceless thing, I can swap them out easily, not a big deal. If it is something that owns your data, and your state accrues
and you've
there.
shared everything private about it, talking about your relationships and your family and work and everything you do. And
I had someone. This is not. I had one story. It was someone who
opened up your email to it.
You can do some insane. Like I had someone. This is not someone I directly talked to myself, but a good friend did. They said someone who used ChatGPT, and they said, "Hey, how would you manipulate me if you had to?" And it goes, "Oh, I would never do that." I said, "Okay, but like, what if you had to?" And it says, "Well, you appear to travel a lot because when you'll often ask me questions at odd times, and when you do, you appear to be more insecure, more lonely, and more anxious. And so I would wait until you asked me a question at an odd time, and then I'd slowly start working in the topic of food and weight, because I know that's something you're insecure about. And then over time, it had this whole plan, this whole thing. And of course it says, oh, I'd never do that, never do that. But it could, right? So like, that's just where this power, the LLMs having this abundant cognitive labor, make sure it's working for you.
That is such a great way to think about AI, think about technology, think about every tool we use is, that's the AI version of if you're not paying for it, you're the product, and we need to think about not rejecting it, but what is the safe way to do it? What is the safe way in which we don't consolidate power into these few trillion-dollar corporations, not just for your own pleasure or happiness, but also for like the future of democracy?
Yeah, it's not for like these are very significant stakes. And I think if you would have said that same sentence, 10 years ago, people are like, "Are you high? What are you talking about?" And now people are like, "Oh, I get it. Oh, I get it. Okay, yeah." Mm-hmm. Which I think in some ways is good because we've had so much that we've taken for granted about sort of democratic systems. And now we can say, "Oh, that's why that's there, and that's why that's important." Yes, I remember when I was watching The Lion King when I was a kid, and at the end, when Simba is fighting Scar, the fire destroys everything. And I said, "Oh no." And my mom goes, No. A fire can clear out the dead and broken things, and now the green things can come back. And I thought of like that for some reason that like jumped into my head a few days ago, thinking about watching this world of like a bunch of things that we care about burn and thinking, okay, how can we build back better? How can we learn as a community, as an organization, as people and as a humanity, how to make these kinds of resilient bottom-up systems that are native to this new cacophonous era that unfortunately the like deeply connected internet means that cacophony is not going away. It's going to get worse and worse. So how do we make institutions and infrastructure that is resilient to that fact as opposed to trying to just pretend like it doesn't exist, which is what we've been doing for a decade.
And we got the social democratic system. We got electoral democracy. We got systems of healthcare and public education and public infrastructure and public health and water. All of these things were achieved through movements of people in struggle as a reaction to what was an incredibly disruptive industrial revolution.
Yeah.
I have one other thing that I want to bring up, and it's a practice you do that I think I just want to talk about it a little bit, which is something so offline and so traditional and something that dates back over 100 years is you organize a regular salon where you curate a group of people. I think you do it monthly, and you bring them to your house and you have this wonderful meal, and it's not a very big group of people. And you are organizing people to get together, most of whom don't know each other. I think when I went, I knew a couple of the people there.
Yeah.
And I didn't even really know you. I knew some other people. I wonder if you could talk about the process of organizing a salon, of organizing people in an offline way to get together and talk about ideas, about how the salon was where the social revolutions of the 1800s came from, and you're doing it today, even though we have all these digital tools.
It's funny. It kind of emerged out of I facilitate a number of like kind of cozy online community spaces because I just need to exist in these kinds of environments where people are yes-anding and thinking about big implications that are still driven from concrete realities. And at one point I was jealous I hadn't been invited. I've heard of some of these dinners existing elsewhere. I was jealous I hadn't been invited to anyone. Someone goes, "Alex, you should just bake one." I was like, "Oh, okay." So I just started making them, and I've done, I think, 31 or so of them. I was just looking through the next one I'm scheduling. Yeah, it just kind of grew up organically out of, I tried to figure out which is the largest amount of people I can have in the thing. It's 12. And I tried to figure out, how do you make a thing where everyone can speak up and it can feel like a single track conversation? How do you bring in different perspectives that are going to resonate with one another, but also challenge one another? And every so often I get it wrong and I go, ooh, okay, that person and that person, great individually, together they're just clashing, and that clash is like taking down the whole vibe for everybody. And so I'm constantly trying to curate and figure out, how do I get the most interesting and intellectually productive conversation to happen by having not people who agree with each other necessarily, although typically the people I bring are people who I think will not be trying to dominate and win the conversation is the main thing I'm looking for. I'm looking for someone who is curious and open-minded and will, when they have some surprising information be said, they'll think, oh, interesting, as opposed to, oh, that's, no. I want someone who's going to, I've never thought about it that way. And so that's the main thing I'm looking for, to make sure it takes one asshole to poop a party. And so you're looking for how to balance that and make sure you don't have that one person, while simultaneously I'm always making sure I bring in a few people who are more junior, who I'm taking a bet on, of somebody who I think I'm looking for. Everyone that I bring, I'm looking for a seed of greatness, something that shows that this is not just some drone somewhere, or just, I'm looking for someone that have unique perspectives. They have a unique experience. They have a unique kind of combination, or sometimes it's someone junior in their career who's got just raw brilliance. And sometimes they say things that are put their foot in their mouth, but they're just say things that surprise me about things I thought I knew. And so I'm just constantly curating. And I think part of it's important is that I am the only person on my phone. I sit there like this typing, because even as you see me in this, I've been taking some notes because I can't not take notes, but I'm the only person on my phone. And I'm carefully watching, by the way, in the conversation. If anyone pulls out their phone, I move the conversation on, because clearly this isn't holding everyone's attention.
Fascinating.
So anyway, there's a whole series of things I'm doing to make sure that space feels resonant. It feels deeply meaningful, and it feels like a place there. We grow as a community together in it. So,
and it's fascinating the way in which you held so many of these, 29 or 30 of them, that led to the creation of this Resonant.
Yeah, in a very real sense.
All of these small conversations where people are like, what are we doing and why? And what should we be doing? And all of these ideas. It's a special thing. And I think that we need to curate more of that in the world.
Yeah, I agree. And so what is the infrastructure to allow that kind of thing to happen? He wrote a book on social media, or social communities and social platforms from before social media was a thing. I'll think of his name. And he had this saying of, virality is in tension with community. And it's one of those statements that at the very first blush does not track. You're like, I don't understand how those are related. And the more you think about it, the more it unfolds, and you realize, oh, this is actually fundamentally true. And I think that in the modern world, and for optimizing, we made it so anything you say can go anywhere and the sky's the limit. But that also means that you get this cacophonous set of things that go wide because they're accidentally too simplistic or what have you. And so creating these kind of cozy communities that are constantly flowing in, they're not closed boundaries, because you need new ideas are coming in. I do make sure each of those dinners, 3 to 4 people have been at the dinner before. I know how the vibe is.
They know the pattern.
Backbone, and I know that they know the norm, and they're going to help me demonstrate it. Because you want this thing that is a community that has very fluid edges, but has something in common. And I do a few other little tight touches to try to make people feel like they're a part of a thing, a capital T thing that matters, without feeling like they're part of a cult or something, or like some closed-ended thing.
Yeah, no, it's so fascinating, because the things you do in doing that are the things we do in good online forums and online groups and communities and everything else. And, I know we've gone on for a long time, but, one of the ideas that we were talking around the office when Twitter was created was this idea that the humanity stays the same. We have this history, and we have been humans for 200,000 years, of which 190,000 of that was small tribal groups that got together in larger gatherings on a semi-regular basis. And the interpersonal dynamics and the communities and everything else, those exist for a long time. And we have always had the need to stay up to date and stay connected and fall in love and support ourselves and raise kids and announce to the world and feel social meaning. And what we're doing today in a world of 8 billion people, a world where we're all together on this internet, is those same things, but it doesn't always have to be a digital space. The things that work for digital community organizing and work for the real world, those are the human things.
Yeah. I was talking to somebody in the Outer Sunset who was creating local situated software for his neighborhood, for his larger neighborhood. And partly because he can vibe code it. And he's making little things to throw a block party in the Outer Sunset. Here's the permits you need, and here's how to here's a little package of stuff you can do. And here's a thing where you can take pictures of posters that you see about community events and upload them, and LLM scrapes them and puts them on a community page that becomes a thing where people feel oh, look, I added one that someone hadn't had before. And now you have a list where you see all the community goings on in your local area. And software before had to be so mass market because it was so expensive to produce. And now if it's becoming cheaper to produce, you can make them be hyper-situated. And that's a very optimistic view to me, that you can use these things to strengthen ties of communities and meaning. And that's why I think, how can we make the world go in this direction? We've got the materials, we just need to, and we've got the potential of this sort of disruptive technology for the tech industry. So how can we just nudge it this way,
The magic to create this technology is no longer held by a small cabal of magicians.
Yeah, that's good.
Thank you so much, Alex, for your time, for your work on the open web. You have a startup that you're putting together, but it's not ready to launch in time to this. So I've heard folks to follow what Common Tools is doing, and when you're ready to talk about it.
I think Stephen Levy said it best when he surmised that it's going to be resonant AF, and I think he's entirely correct. We are trying to do something that really tries to make resonant software, resonant computing, the default thing in this new era of AI. And I think, I'm trying to make an open ecosystem that has those characteristics, and I can't wait to share it when we're ready to get sort of the folks using it. But
I'm so excited for the work, and so appreciative for the Resonant Computing Manifesto and the idea of how do we organize ourselves and how do we use these tools for making a better world. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks again to Alex Komoroske for coming on Revolution.Social. Our intro and outro music is a remix of the Italian anti-fascist song Bella Ciao, courtesy of White Records.
This episode was edited and produced by Eric Johnson from lightningpod.fm. Our executive producer is me, Alice Chan from Flock Marketing.
Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, share this episode if you loved it, and to sign up for our email newsletter, visit Revolution.Social.
And for more interviews like this, follow Revolution.Social on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Nostos, Fountain.fm, or wherever you get your podcasts.
And to paraphrase the Zapatista subcomandante Marcos, we need a social media revolution to make revolution possible. We'll be back next week. See you then.